My Gavan and Melanine, and well met indeed. I am Arachir Galadirth, and head of the modding team behind Divide and Conquer. And welcome back to the same as we continue on with the faction overviews with the penultimate overview covering the nation of Dunland. So, Dunland is a small starting location. You only have three regions, Dunlarach, Bairig, and Dunyard. Dunland Border, Dunland Lowlands, and Dunland Proper. Because this is actually the region that on most maps has the actual words Dunland. Now, of course, that's not a scientific exact, but if that is where the actual word is written, generally speaking, that is where that region is. The army that you begin with is also on the smaller side. Dunlarach only has a couple of units, your faction leaders in there. Bairig only has one additional unit outside of the general, and Dunyard only has two as well. And if we go to your army tab, you'll note there's no one hiding in a fort or anything like that. So, very small start, but not the end of the world that it's that small, as we'll see in a moment. But moving to custom generals, I've already mentioned your faction leader. Here he is, Chieftain Yagthak. Looking particularly grim and quite dirty. The gentleman could do with a bath. He has Guardians of Dunland, one of Dunland's, if not Dunland's, finest unit. You'll note the defense of 27. Absolutely formidable unit. So a nice one to start the game off with. Menthar over here, who is Merlin from the King Arthur film. Came out many years ago. He has Beast Slayers. So a good archer general starting you off in Bairig. And then lastly, down in Dunyard, you have Huntmaster Frecker. And Huntmaster Frecker has Eisenmach Axeman, so a very strong, armor-piercing warrior. So you get three good starting generals, none of which, of course, are your actual bodyguard. We'll have to see that in the second half of the video. Just looking at the strategy models before we can progress on, that is what your faction leader will always look like. So you'll note the sort of gold armor with the red cape. This is what a generic general always looks like. It's pretty much the same, but just with silver and brown instead of gold and red. And then a captain, and let's use Dunyard actually. A captain will look like that. I've completely forgotten their name. It looks like that. It's a unit that we'll see in the second half of the video, but I've forgotten their name. So a nice variety in your custom, in your campaign strategy models for your generals and whatnot. You'll at least be able to tell which is which. Turning to your family tree, you do have one. Previously, I don't think possibly you did. No, I think that was Edward. I think Dunland always has had. So Chieftain Yagthak's your faction leader, and Frecker is his son, and Frecker could do with being married. And indeed, I actually got a marriage offer on turn 2, so that comes in quite quickly. Menthar is the brother of Yagthak, and he's married out to Guchiel, and Hilda is married to Yagthak. And you'll note about their Chieftain Yunthur died peacefully in 2979. The reason that their death portrayal is just a tombstone is because that's the way that we are able to give different portraits to different religions within the same culture. So it separates out because Dunland and Enedwaith and the Northern Dunedain share the same culture, but of course they have a different religion, so it allows us to give them different portraits. Victory conditions as Dunland. This is a long campaign. Short campaign's always the easiest. It's better to do the long one, I think. Hold 30 regions, which is not in a small amount. But you have to hold Dunlarach, Edoras, and Bree. And you need to kill Rohan and Bree, your two nearest and dearest. So a relatively straightforward campaign in terms of victory conditions, to be honest. No major threats. Unfortunately, Rohan is a cavalry nation, and the AI in Medieval 2 just can't handle cavalry, so Rohan is not difficult to fight against. I've seen a lot of people that go absolutely crazy when I say that Isengard is easy and fighting Rohan is no challenge at all. And people say, what are you talking about? They get loads of troops. I get killed off by them all the time. And I think you probably do at the moment, but like any tough situation, a little bit of practice, you'll realise that actually Rohan are so easy to defeat and that it's very difficult to make it balanced in their favour because cavalry is just so abysmal when controlled by the AI. But anyway, turning to the area you're in as Dunland, of course you've got the Misty Mountains on your eastern border giving you a lot of protection there. So any threats coming from the west, the south or the north. But to the north you have protection from rivers. The Gwathlo, which is the major one here, which can be sailed. And Tharbad of course guards that top crossing, which recently was changed into a single city. And in future versions will be custom again, but at the moment is just a large Numenorian or Dunedain city on the northern bank. You can cross this smaller, the tributary of the Gwathlo. Does it have its own name? I think it does. It's the Glanduin, isn't it? Yes, it is. The Ninain Elf, or the Swanfleet River, is the one that runs away on the north and eventually becomes the Mythythel. But this one is the Glanduin. Anyway, you're not all that bothered about that, but you can cross this one, and then it crosses further up, I believe, up here, yes, just north or south of Fenestrin and north of Coloniac, and then you have to come back round and down. It's quite a long way around, which is on purpose, because it gives more weight and importance to Tharbad. So your northern border is protected entirely by that if you want to shut down Bree's advances. Of course, to the west, you just have a long land border with your possible dearest allies or most hated enemies, the clans of Enedwaith. Custom battle maps around you. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, Tharbad is no longer custom, so you'll have to wait for future versions for that. Isengard is, of course, custom, as is Edoras and Hornburg. The mouse should have been the other way around. But outside of that, you're quite a ways away from any custom settlements, so you'll be fighting predominantly and primarily in the Wild Men settlements, which many of you will recognise if you have played Rome Total War, or I think, and its Barbarian Invasion, because they come from that mostly. And they do look very similar to the campaign strategy model there as well. They're pretty cool battle maps, I think, personally, and they add some variety. But if you're fighting against Enedwaith mostly, that'll be what you're fighting in. Speaking of Enedwaith, let's turn to your neighbours in diplomacy. You are, as you might expect, allied to Isengard, but you do start at war with Rohan and Bree, so you're all set up, really. You could just make peace with everyone else, and you can achieve your victory conditions without any diplomatic anything. But you can, of course, backstab Isengard if you want. But the real threat to you will come in the form of Enedwaith, and whether they'll be particularly aggressive or whether they will just be not bothered at all. They used to have a script, Enedwaith, that made them go to war with the people around them if they were not at war with anyone by turn 40. That script actually included a flaw, which only came to light years later, that instead of only going to war with people around them if they weren't at war, they would go to war with people around them no matter what. So even if they were at war with Bree, they would then turn on you anyway. Now that script was removed, but I can't remember, I'm afraid, if it was 4.5 that it was removed for, so the version this overview is pertinent to, or whether it was removed for version 5. I think it was 4.5, but in any event, there's a very real chance you'll be at war with Enedwaith for a long time. Now, Enedwaith and Dunland, both in the early game, don't have very good units, which is one of the major reasons why we think these factions are possibly quite disliked. Your units are quite weak, and you need to use skill and cunning to overcome other enemies, but you don't need to use skill and cunning to overcome each other because you are equals. Dunland are better in the later game than Enedwaith. They're much better thanks to their links with Isengard. But in the early game, you're about on par with one another, so it just comes down to you outsmarting the AI, which should not be difficult. They're not very clever. If you turn on Isengard, however, they outclass you from the get-go, so it could be quite a challenge unless you manage to sweep them away in sudden onset, to quote a line from the book. Rohan, as I say, won't be a challenge no matter what, because cavalry is useless, and Bree is also not particularly good. They're another underdog story, and so you're on par with them again. The real threat in the area that you do not want to raise the ire of are, of course, the Dunedain and the Elves. Now, if the Elves actually do something, it's really rare, but sometimes they do. They sometimes do push through Enedwaith and make it down to the river, and if you've pushed through Enedwaith from the other side, you might meet them, and you'll probably have some difficulty fighting against the Elves. Now, the Northern Dunedain do outclass you from the get-go again, and they're very powerful, but of course their front is quite wide, and they're spread mostly fighting Angmar, so you probably won't have to deal with them if you avoid them. So by crossing over at Tharbad and just hitting Bree, you can probably ignore the Dunedain. But if they do come for you, prepare yourself, for those around you are stronger than you, which we shall see more in the second half. Turning to economy and buildings and whatnot, well, you are wild men, so there's no large cities, which generally people don't tend to complain about, I think because thematically it works very well. They wouldn't have huge stone cities like the Dunedain to have, because that would lessen the abilities of the Dunedain, the Númenórean children. If they can build grand cities, but then so can Bob, who's been living in a shack for all of his life, then it just takes something away from the Dunedain, doesn't it? So you can't get above a large town. Castles, you can build a castle, which is the middle tier of the three, but you can't get strongholds. So you get a little bit of a reduction in terms of the buildings that are available to you, because you don't have that top tier. That is offset by giving the Wildmen their own unique economic building, and the tannery is yours. So the tannery increases tradable goods, gives you a flat income, and increases your culture, which is nice. I like that there are more than one building that increases culture, because I do think that's worthwhile. Turning to guilds for you only get one, and it's the Fighter's Pit, Warrior's Hut, and Warrior's Hall, and it speeds up the replenishment of melee infantry, which is a very useful tool for Dunland. So you do want to try and get Warrior's Huts. And you'll note that the Warrior's Hall allows you to train Eisenmach Axemen, even if you have not yet reached the point where you can. You'll still be able to get them out of this. And indeed, if you build it in a settlement that can already get Eisenmach Axemen, then it just speeds up their replenishment drastically, and you'll get one quite regularly. Because all recruitment stacks. So if you accidentally put recruitment of a same unit in two different buildings and you build them, then their two times will combine together and drastically reduce the time it takes. I'm not sure of the actual calculations. If one unit comes every 10 turns and one comes every 5 turns, I don't know how the game actually works out what it's going to do. But needless to say, they come quickly. Outside of that, though, you've got the usual things like livestock farming to increase your population growth. It also gives a flat building income, and of course gives one of the game's best units, the Farmhand Pikeman. But that's about it in terms of buildings and whatnot. Your diplomat comes out of Dunland from the unique building Wolf's Hall, which is just a nice little sort of leader building. You will note that the ancillary training ground and the Ballister Maker have the same UI, and that is to be changed in future versions, because that's misleading. You do get a ship, I think. Enedwythe definitely do, but I'm fairly certain that you do. Oh, wrong building. I'm in the Master Builders. Yes, you get the longship. I thought you did. Yeah, so Dunland do get a boat. So you are able to sail the Gwathlo and then out into the sea. But note that you have one of the worst boats, the second from bottom in terms of boat hierarchy. So you're not going to beat anyone on the water, so try not to fight anybody, but you can use it as a ferry where and when you need it. And the advanced blacksmith, of course, Dunland do get an advanced blacksmith because everyone is more advanced than you. So you can make use of it. You just need to conquer basically anywhere. And as ever, if you look at the changelog in the description below, it'll tell you which regions you get the advanced blacksmith in. So then we come to gameplay events. Well, Dunland, I'm afraid, is the same as Enedwythe. The only script that Dunland has is the uniting of the clans, which is listed in... I think it's Yagthax, the Wooden Crown, yes. So you have the same script as Enedwythe in that if you unite all of the clans together, you unlock a unique building which gives you training of a very powerful unit, the Guardians of Dunland, which you have here. They are a almost clone of the Orthanc Guard, but with a Dunland flavour. As you can see, they have Dunland shields and they have a brown cape as well. And they are they're on purpose a direct correlation to the Orthanc Guard, because in the writing that we've written for the uniting for Dunland, once you unite the clans, Isengard sees your power, and Saruman sends you more assistance in the form of these fantastic suits of armour that you then outfit your finest warriors in, which is why they have really, really high defence. If you ever need to know which regions you need to just look at the Wooden Crown, which Yagthac holds, and you'll see there it's Nelchlun, Malfin, Caladir, Erinvorn, Angren Bay, Parthior, Cairil, Druithior, Malrenaith, Saraline, Hertshire, Lugiar, Larferen, Dunland Lowlands, Dunland Border, and Dunland Proper. So it is basically just all of this region. Almost everything from the Gap to the sea, and I can't recall if it was over the north of the Gwathlo or not, but it's just all of that region. And so yes, that includes Enedwythe. In order to unite the clans, you have to defeat Enedwythe. So the decision is very much, do you want to try and ally them and send them off north as a buffer to Bree and the High Elves, and maybe even a buffer to Isengard if you're feeling like you might form a great Wildman alliance against everyone around you, or you can just crush them and get the best unit that you have available to yourself. There used to be a script for Dunland, which some of you might be thinking of, whereby their best units were restricted depending on how well they were doing. But we removed that because I just think it was I don't think that's a fun way of introducing units to the game personally. So that was cut. So your only script now is uniting the clans. And that is all of Dunland's gameplay events. As moving forward in terms of difficulty, I'm not going to comment on the difficulty of Dunland. I haven't set up a poll or anything because it would need to be on an external website. So instead, feel free to comment on the video with how hard or easy you think Dunland is, and others can read that and then get a view for themselves. And that does conclude the campaign side for Dunland. I was just going to ruminate, because recently obviously we ran a poll on which factions are favoured in Divide and Conquer, and Dunland unfortunately came out as one of the least popular. And I think that it's a theme that we saw throughout, is that a lot of the least popular nations are the ones where you have to really think about how you're going to win. That's not to discredit all of you and say you're all morons, but I mean, people generally like to play as the nations that have knights in shining armour with powerful units, and they can wipe the field with thousands and thousands and get that sort of superiority. Whereas playing as Dunland, you're the underdog for most of the campaign. Same with Enedwaith, same with Anduin, same with Bree, and all four of those were relatively disliked in the vote, and all four of them share that same feature of being weak. Basically, your army is weak. You rely on alternatives like ambushing, like javelin units, and trying to position your armies in better positions rather than just hitting the enemy head on. But Dunland suffer from this a little less, I think, because your chief enemies are the other weak people. So Enedwaith and Bree are your main enemies, and the three of you, when looked at in a vacuum, are equal to one another, essentially. Bree probably just edge it with the slightly stronger troops, but then no, actually, I think Dunland are the strongest of the three, personally. And then, as I've said many times, and we'll say one last time before we jump over, playing against Rohan is easy. If you bring any form of anti-cavalry unit, even lowly spears, even the lowly farmhand pikemen, you will find fighting Rohan an absolute cakewalk. And that is if you even need to bother. Isengard may well win. The Isengard-Rohan balance goes either way quite a lot of the time. We're feeling like it's in quite a good place, actually. We get lots of reports that Isengard win, but we get lots of reports that Rohan win, which tells us that it is actually working as intended. So there's a chance that either one really will take it. Isengard, generally speaking, do clinch it. I'd say they win more than Rohan, but that's ideal, because Isengard would have won had Rohan not had assistance from various outside sources. So it is reliant on them being saved. So as Dunland, taking out Rohan is a doggle, is the point I'm making. But let's jump over and have a look at the very brown roster of Dunland. Welcome then to this flat grassy plain where the army of Dunland stands. And you'll note Dunland are an infantry faction. Hardly any archers at all. There are only 2 out of the entire roster, which is very low. You do have 3 cavalry units though, so a nice, at least some variety in cavalry. But generally speaking, and on the whole, you are an infantry faction. So let us start off with your infantry then. So clan spearmen take up the lowly spot, unfortunately, of being your worst unit. 2 attack, 2 charge, 6 defense. Now they're your worst unit, but those aren't actually that bad against... I mean, they get crapped on in almost every single video, don't they? But Snagger! Nothing is as bad as Snagger, so you can count your lucky stars that at least your worst unit will take on the other worst units in the game. So the 6 defense isn't actually that bad for such an early starting unit, and will help greatly against any cavalry unit, really. Although you won't come up against many unless you do go for Rohan first. You are wild men, and you're not wild men in the sort of barbarian sense that the Germanic tribes fought off the Romans. You're wild men in the sense that you're content living simple lives of hunting, fishing, and living off the land. You're not barbarians, and indeed the Dunlandings really are coerced into war in the Third Age by the power of Saruman's voice, more so than their own deep-seated hatred of Rohan. Yes, they hate Rohan, but Rohan has beat them up and down the countryside for so many years, and only once in the long history of the two peoples have Dunland ever really come out on top. And even then, they were then soundly beaten only a few years later. And that Wolf is the gentleman who is the most famous Dunlending, because he actually sat on the throne at Edoras before shortly thereafter dying, and then Dunland never really crop up again. For a little bit more brief history on Dunland, just very, very brief, you used to live in the lands that Rohan now claim as their own, and the land of Calanathan, and then when the Rohirrim came, or the Eored came down from the north, and Gondor gave them Calanathan, you were slowly pushed further west and west and west and west and west until eventually Rohan claimed the whole of the land, and you were then kicked way out into Dunland, which is a ragged hill country with poor fertilization or agricultural ability. And so you basically spend the next 1,000 years just hating Rohan and claiming that they've stolen your ancestral lands, which of course they did, but they're stronger than you, and that unfortunately tends to be the way things go. So anyway, you have poor morale. That's a very long way of me saying you don't have fantastic morale. You will fight, but you're not going to fight to the death. Your cause is not worth fighting to the death. You're not that kind of people. But supporting your clan spearmen are clan axemen, who are here somewhere. Oh, there we are. I couldn't see the green underneath them. Clan Axemen, similar sorts of stats. So 5 defense, but 3 attack and 3 charge. So they're slightly more aggressive at the cost of 1 less defense. But again, both of these units' primary focus is tying down elite units so that something better can come and finish them off. Or just making up that long battle line so you've got at least something to hold the line while your more expensive and rarer units do some actual killing. Again, poor morale response. You don't like fighting out in the open. You are a people used to hills and forests. So fighting in the deserted wastelands puts you at an unease. You, however, get a bonus in every other type of terrain, so it's only the barrens that you don't like. But remember, I don't know the actual application of this. I've never seen it written anywhere what it actually does. Whether it improves your attack stat, whether it improves your morale, whether it lowers something. I don't know. I've never seen it written down. I've never seen it explained. So you can, generally speaking, disregard these. I don't think they really have that much effect at all. It's a very cool idea that I think was really underutilized by Medieval 2. Next up, we will go to your Berserkers. Dunlanding Berserkers are your first strike infantry, and a relatively good one for... have I mentioned the costs yet? No. Dunland are very cheap. Your units don't cost very much, so you can amass quite a lot of forces. And Dunlanding Berserkers, this early tier unit, has an 8 attack that's armor piercing. They are so cost effective, because they're very, very cheap again. Their cost is definitely between 300 and 400, I think. Their defense is relatively poor, obviously, of 5, so arrow fire will just obliterate them, so don't let the enemy shoot them. But if you can get into your target, yes, these will probably all pay with their lives, but they will take a lot of them down before they go. They have really, really good aggressive stats. Good morale, because they're berserkers, they're slightly more willing to die for their heartlands, or their homelands. And impetuous morale response, so they deal very well to shocks. They have a 10% movement speed bonus as well. Did we see that on the others? 5% on the clans. So a very, very good unit, the Berserker. Definitely one you want to outfit into your armies. Note though, again, if you're fighting Enid Wythe, they don't really have any armoured units anyway, so the armour piercing aspect of the Berserkers doesn't matter, but the attack of 8 is still fantastic no matter which way you slice it. You also have an early tier pike unit, Dunlanding Pikemen, a fantastic little unit and one that you would expect to get because your primary adversary for the past nearly 1,000 years has been Rohan, who ride horses. So 2 attack, but remember they're pikes, so that's really closer to sort of 6 or 7 or so. Don't worry about the charge because they're pikes, but the defense again is low of only 6. But remember, they are pikes. They are only slightly better than farmhand pikemen, but I think there's a few more of them. I think farmhand pikes only have 150 or something like that, and these have 165. But I could be wrong on that. I frequently am. Their morale is average, morale response is average, so we're starting to climb up a little bit. They're ready and willing and able to take on any horse that the enemy throws at you. If again, I can talk about Enid Wythe, because you almost certainly will be fighting Enid Wythe. They will probably force your hand and attack you. But Enid Wythe do get a couple of cavalry units, including a chariot. So the pikes will have use against them as well. Your first archer unit comes in here. Clan Hunters. A very simple archer that I've always thought doesn't look like it's dressed for battle and looks more like it's dressed for dinner. And it's just wearing a tunic, basically. But anyway, Clan Hunters, 1 melee attack and 4 defense. Don't let them get shot at, and definitely don't let them get into melee. They will just melt away. But a missile attack of 3 for a starting archer is really good. So even though you only get 2 archer units, they're both a little better than others around their sort of tier. So 3 missile is good and a useful unit to have. Poor morale, average morale response with 5% movement speed buff, 18 missiles, 150 on the range, and low accuracy. Then by far and away one of the worst archers that the game has, outside of Orc factions. But that 3 missile damage, 165 of them, they do get kills. But you have to keep them alive. Do not let the enemy fight them. Your first cavalry unit also comes in at this early tier, and they are Dunlanding Horsemen. Now this is a typical early tier horse unit. It's garbage. 6 defense. A 6 defense for a horse is basically 0. Remember, horses have a huge hitbox, and so small defenses means that they just die so easily. Their attack is only 4, their charge is 4. This unit has 1 purpose, or 2 purposes, sorry, that all early tier cavalry has. Running into the back of a unit where they will not come to any harm, and chasing down units that are already running away. You do not want to make them fight in almost any other way. Charging them head-on into infantry, even if it's not even anti-cavalry infantry, will probably see you lose more of your own horsemen than you will of the enemy. Their defense is really low. Now that's hyperbolic and an exaggeration. You will kill most of the enemy. You're on a horse, for crying out loud. But remember, they're just garbage horsemen, and so don't expect wonders. And then we come to your tier 2, where we find the Dunland Champions, which is the unit I forgot the name of. The campaign strategy model is based on this unit. They are javelin throwers, and they have a 9 missile with their javelins, which is pretty good. But something that people have been commenting recently, which actually really resonates with me, I always find javelin units to be really damned poor. They don't tend to get very many kills, and they tend to die really easily. And some people have suggested that then perhaps the AI thinks javelin units are a real threat, so it targets them first. And now that I think back of all the times I've played DAC, that does seem to actually apply to the situations that I can think up. So I think the AI does prioritise javelin units, which is why they then die so much, which means they then do very little. Because on paper, this unit is absolutely fantastic. A 9 missile attack with a javelin is really very good. 4 javelins to throw, many units only have 3. 65 meter range and high accuracy, so they're good javelin throwers. The defense is 8, which is nothing to scoff at. That's a good early tier defense. And their melee attack is 7, and it's armor piercing. That large club thing they've got on their back is armor piercing. So they're a really good unit on paper, but I find in practice they do almost nothing. And I think it's because they are targeted so much that by the time they ever get into battle, they're already been killed. But for the cost of 545, what you get, this is one of the most cost-effective units in your army, bar possibly the Berserker at the start. They're really, really, really cheap, and they'll get a lot of kills if they don't get killed first, but they frequently do. So you have to watch out for that. But a unit that will defend and hold the line, I say but too much in these videos, don't I, is a Dunlanding Warband. Dunlanding Warband have a melee of 7. Oh, I'm on the wrong unit. A melee of 4. I thought that was too high for a spear unit. Melee of 4, a charge of 3, but a defense of 13. So as usual with a spear unit, they're not going to get very many kills. They're not going to make it into your top 3. But they will defend like champions. They will hold that line, and it'll take a long time for them to die. Average morale response. They're a good unit to have in your army, particularly for Dunland. A nice unit to hold the line. You also get Dunlanding Raiders. They were previously a Merc-only unit that I think now have been made an actual mainline unit for you. So an 11 defense, but a 7 attack and a 3 charge. This is the same situation as the Clan Axeman and Clan Spearman. There's a strong defensive unit, and their counterpart is a more aggressive unit. Dunlanding Raiders use them to flank the enemy, but they can hold the line in a pinch. Your next archer comes in here and is your last archer, but also a very good archer, the Beast Slayers. And they do as their name suggests, because their secondary weapon is a spear. Well, it used to be a pike actually, but I think it still is a pike. Oh, I can't recall. I should have fought with them. Well, we'll see them in battle in a moment, won't we? They can hide anywhere and are one of only 2 units in your roster that can do that. You're not the ambush faction. That's Enid Wythe. So you watch out for that when you fight against them. They're skilled against mounts because they're either a pike or a spear, as we'll see in a moment. Their melee is 6. Their missile is 5, which is quite nice for a unit that only costs 700. Charge of 5 and a defense of 14. So you've got a unit that actually will hold up well if it does come into melee, because they have good melee stats. Now, normally we do actually put the weapon in here, but I can't see it. It does say spears. They used to be a pike unit, that's all, but I think they have been changed to a spear unit. Yes, they definitely have, because they've got a shield. So it's cleared up. Yes, they were a pike, they are now a shield. So they are a solid spearman afterward. 1 more defense than the main spearman, the warband, and a higher attack of 6. So they're a better spearman than the spearman at their tier, and they are your best archer. So a very, very good unit, one that you should train when and where you can. Your next cavalry unit are Mounted Warband. Oh, do note that I just saw there, I forgot to mention, they come from a mountain region only. So you'll need to get familiar with the green books, because they'll tell you which regions are mountainous. Next up, Mounted Warband. This is a cavalry unit that now can do something. It's got a spear for a start, which is always better for cavalry. Its charge is 6. Its defense is 13. That's the clincher. It's got enough defense to actually hit an enemy and not die instantly. So a good cavalry unit. It does what you'd want cavalry to do. Charge into the enemy, run away, charge into the enemy, run away, repeat. Then we come to your elite tier where the Wolf's units come in. But first of all, we'll deal with the War Chanter, because they're kind of a halfway house between 2 and 3. War Chanters are a scald unit. That's what they used to be called in Medieval 2. And they cry aloud to the heavens to improve your morale. So they have the chanting ability, basically. They inspire troops that are nearby them anyway, and they then have the chant that inspires troops as well. Now, it only affects nearby troops. It doesn't affect the entire map. So you've got to try and position them in the best place. But they can drastically increase the morale of units around them and keep them fighting for much, much longer. They have an attack of 10 if the enemy does get to them, and a 16 defense with a two-handed sword. They are very good melee warriors, but there's only 47 of them, so stun locking is a very real threat, and they do suffer from it. So try not to use them in melee unless you're flanking with them or something like that. But ideally, you don't want to use them in melee anyway. Their main purpose is to raise the morale of all of your low-tier trash so that it fights on for longer. And they really do work. This is one of those systems where actually it does what it says on the tin. Having a war chanter unit chanting behind your low-tier spearmen, for example, you will see them fight on noticeably longer than they normally would. However, units running away isn't really a risk for the human player. I find that if my units are running away, it's because we've lost the battle, so war chanters aren't going to make a difference anyway. But it's rare that I have a unit run away when I win a battle. So I don't know if many people's experience obviously will vary, but for me, war chanters I don't think would have much use, because if I'm running away, it's because I've lost. They frighten the enemy as well, and I've already mentioned they can hide anywhere, so you can hide them and then position them quite nicely to support your forces. They also move faster as you'd hope, so that they can get in behind your troops. Your battle line can meet the enemy and lock them down, and then your chanters can run in behind and support your forces. Good morale, average morale response 700, which isn't too bad for the stats, but remember, there's only 47. And then we come to your elites. So we'll start with the wolf swords. Wolf swordsmen are your first sort of really heavily armoured unit, so you see an armour of 10, that's really quite good. A defence of 18, this unit is already better than anything Enid Wythe has to offer, so that's how I mean as in Dunland have better elites than Enid Wythe. I couldn't have meant it in any other way, they're just better. Their morale is good, their morale response is good, no movement speed buff, they're just a solid, dependable sword and shield unit, and there they are in all their glory. And they are supported though by a unit that really will change battles, Wolf's Pikes, a very fine pike unit indeed. 5 attacks, so with the animation, consider that more like 15. 15 total defense, a very, very good pike unit, but they are starting to get costly. Wolf Swords 810, I think the pikes are around 900. So, whilst that's cheaper than a lot of other factions' elites, for you, it is quite a costly unit. Good morale response, and 100% movement speed, so no change to the speed. But a good pike, one you should definitely get. And then we come to your real two outstanding units, the Eisenmach. So the Eisenmach Axemen are fantastic strike infantry. Effective against armour, frighten nearby enemy infantry, and if those of you that can recall the top 10 strike infantry, Eisenmach Axemen made it into the list, despite not having the most amazing stats. There are 165 of them. And they repeatedly made it into the top 10 list in terms of how many kills they could get. They're a very, very, very aggressive unit, but because their defense is only 13, they're berserkers but better, but they had suffered from the same problems. They're likely to fight later game units, and later game units will have more attack and more defense. So even though they're really aggressive, their defense is so low that they will die in the assault. So Eisenmach Axemen normally trade sort of 2 for 1, but then that's still pretty good if you're going up against, say, I don't know, Citadel Guard of Gondor or Uruk-hai of Isengard. So a very, very good and cost-effective unit. They frighten the enemy as well, and effective against armour, obviously. No movement speed change, very good morale response, and they come from your homeland. Your homeland is the 3 regions you start the game with. So they're quite restricted. And lastly, at this tier are the counterpart of the Axemen, the Eisenmach Raiders. Eisenmach Raiders are really good cavalry. A cavalry unit that can give some of the Rohirrim a run for their money. Total offense of 17, 8 attack and 8 charge. They come from obviously your homeland again because they're Eisenmach. Very good morale response. Their secondary attack is 7. The charge the defense of 17 and the charge of 8 makes them a really good cavalry unit. They are very, very useful. They cost 1,000 though, but they are worth it. Get them in your army. And then lastly, if you unite all the lands of Dunland, you get the Guardians of Dunland. And they are, as I've already mentioned, just the Orthanc Guard. But that is on purpose, because they literally are Orthanc Guard, but wielding a shield. That is why they look the same. The premise behind the 2 units is the same. The Orthanc Guard in the are Dunlendings, who Saruman has outfitted in his finest armour to act as his personal guard, because for all of the power and strength of Uruk-hai, he still trusts humans more. The Guardians of Dunland occupy that exact same premise. They're the same Dunlendings that act in the Orthanc Guard, but they're now fighting for Dunland instead, and Saruman has sent them on their way with the armour he gives his best units. So that's why they are basically the same. But we have still got a few unit slots that we can play around with, and we don't really need any units at the moment, so they do occupy their own slot. If we absolutely came down to it and we were desperate for units but slots, then maybe this unit would just become the Orthanc Guard and we'd remove the Guardian. But until then, they occupy their own visual design. They have an attack of 8 and a defense of 26. They are a really powerful spear unit. They will hold the line for days on end. And having Chieftain Yagthak start with a unit of these is really powerful. You've just got to keep him alive because, of course, the whole battalion is gone if he dies. They can do a shield wall, one of your only units that actually can, although they come in so late. And they require a unified Enedwaith, as it says there. It's annoying that it cuts off the top when they're capitalised, isn't it? Good morale, or very good morale response, no movement speed buff. They don't like grassland or barren, they prefer forest and they prefer the winter. Not really sure why we've given them a dislike of grassland. As I say, it makes almost no difference whatsoever. I'm fairly convinced that these bonuses are so negligible that they might as well not exist. So don't really read too much into those. They inspire your forces, which is always very, very nice as well. But they are costly. They cost 1,200. But that defense of 26, that's up there in some of the highest defenses. Remember that dwarves, who have the highest total, the pure total defense stats, are taking all 3 points together. So the shield can change this. But the total defense, the highest ones are dwarves, who have around 30-ish. The kind of mainstream units. I'm not including people like Sauron or trolls. Elves have defense of up around 30 as well, and Gondor and Dunedain and things like that get up to around 28, 29. So they're really up there with a really good defense. And lastly, the final unit in your roster is your bodyguard, Chieftain's Bodyguards. And they are a very good little bodyguard because they're armor-piercing. Armor-piercing bodyguards always do very well and are a really good addition to any roster. Attack of 9, charge of 5, total defense of 19. They're a very good, solid unit. Remember, there's only 78 of them, so watch out for that. But a good bodyguard unit. One of the better bodyguard units, if truth be told, relative to the rest of the roster that they come in for. Again, they like everything but Baron. Very good and no movement speed buff. And that's it. Let's hand it over to the AI. We won't play the game this week because I've already mentioned about 3 times now that, of course, Isengard is the only faction left. And so Isengard will occupy next week's slot. Now, what we want to see... No, we worked out Beastslayers were spears anyway, didn't we? So let's just speed it up. And let all of our forces stand in a line. I foolishly, again, have not set one of these 2 armies to be the defender, so they both stand in front of each other and sort of wait and see who's going to do what, whereas what I should have done is set us as defenders, and then the AI will definitely attack, but they generally do anyway. There is the Guard of the Hand, one of the best, if not the best, crossbow unit the game has. Definitely tied with Broadbeam Marksman. That's Saruman's personal bodyguard. A very, very good unit. Isengard as well, just while we're on the topic. I am going to do a video tomorrow, in fact, that will detail the results of the poll and tell you who the most favourite factions and least favourite factions were. And I will do a lore video, but that will be next week. And that'll be on the Battle of the Nirnaeth Ir Arnoediad. But Isengard polled as quite possibly the most popular evil faction in the game. So, spoiler alert for tomorrow's video. But that was when I last checked, which was about 2 days ago. But we have got it at times 6. I'm not overly concerned if our armies don't fight, to be honest. We only really want to see what the enemy looks like. And they are just holding out for their siege to fire, aren't they? There's the special armor that they give their trolls, but they are just normal trolls. We saved a unit slot there back when we needed one. There's a fantastic Uruk-hai bodyguards with their white helmets, courtesy of Reforged. Thank you very much to them for allowing us to use certain models. There's more. They've got a lot of Uruk-hai bodyguards, haven't they? Blimey. There's the Ballastai of Isengard and Berserkers at the back there. And that'll do you. So that concludes today's episode. So I do hope that more people will play Dunland, as it is amongst the beta testers. It's a very popular faction. People like the underdog story. And there's a lot of options with Dunland. You can backstab Isengard, you can clear out Eriador. You're right on that sort of crossroads of the world, if you will, because you can go east and you can go west. So there are lots of possibilities. But for now, that concludes. So thank you very much for watching, and until we speak again, Nevair na den Perimad Melonin, and farewell.